This is the Nintendo Entertainment System, also known as the NES or the NES for short, depending on which side of the fence you're on there. But this is a system that I believe a lot of people see as the most important system ever made. However, I have talked to some younger gamers and they don't seem to remember this at all. They don't really know anything about it. And it's a little concerning because I look at this system and I do see it as the undisputed most important system ever made. I don't think there's an argument for it at all. I just think that's outright fact. So today we're going to take a look at the NES. We're going to open it up and I'm going to show you why.
The Nintendo Entertainment System. This is a console that I have so many fond memories of from my childhood, whether it was shooting ducks down or being massively blown away by Super Mario 3, we'll just say that. I could not get enough of what this system had to offer. I mean, it introduced me to the Blue Bomber, which in turn became my favorite franchise in gaming. I feel like a lot of younger gamers who are coming into the hobby right now look at this system and they don't understand what the NES did back in the early days of games that was just so important, especially with the odds being so heavily stacked against them. I experienced this recently when talking to some of my younger nephews who really like Fortnite. See, they really had no idea what the original Nintendo system went through and how it shaped the gaming world today. But don't worry, I made sure they got a Nintendo Classic system, and now they can't stop trying to beat Super Mario 3. It's not as easy, I think, as some of the newer games today, so they're having a bit of a harder time. Now today I wanted to take a look back at the 8-bit system and talk about some of its history, and take it apart to look over some of its weird and different features, because there are actually quite a few of them. So with all of this out of the way, guys, let's take a look at the most important console ever made.
Now this is a system that I liberated from a flea market. That's why it's missing the flap here. That's actually the reason I have the NES Classic out, because it's supposed to have this flap, just to give you an idea of what it's supposed to look like with the Nintendo logo on the front. They actually did a pretty good job kind of, I guess, simulating what it's supposed to look like in a very small box. But the NES Classic is a great way to pick up an NES if you just want to play some of the games on your newer HDMI-enabled TV. But I wanted to look at the original one despite missing the flap anyway. In fact, it's probably in a better home now anyway, because I'll probably take it apart, clean it, and make sure it's working again. I'll even give you guys a few tips to fix yours up. And we'll talk about some of the issues internal to this thing and some of the weird things that they did with this in terms of design. So let's get into this. I'm actually going to be taking this apart while we're kind of going through, I guess, the history of the NES and talk a bit about it. So it's going to be pretty fun to check this out.
Back in the early 80s, the video game space was ruled by a few systems, with the largest and by far the most popular being the Atari 2600. Go ask your parents or your grandparents or whoever. More than likely, this is the system out of all of the ones from back in the 80s that they absolutely remember. At the time, video games were brand new, and with the introduction of the swappable cartridge, retailers were pushing this new stream of revenue like crazy. See, rather than having to sell the system with built-in games like a plug-and-play, brick-and-mortar stores all of a sudden had a way to monetize beyond that initial purchase of the console. And retailers were definitely not the only entity looking to make a ton of cash from this new feature. Developers and publishing companies went crazy creating game after game without a concern for quality or market saturation. Now, the games would vary in price, with the average game costing anywhere between $30 and $50. See, that was back in 1980, so if we take a look with inflation, these games would cost anywhere between $90 and $150 today in 2018. So think about going out right now and buying a game on the level of the Atari 2600, one game, and it being anywhere from $90 to $150. That would probably start putting you off from games. Now, of course, it's different now because we have so many different companies and games to play and these big, massive open world games and everything. But back then, this is what gaming was to everyone. We didn't have anything other than Pitfall, or if you want to go to Asteroids or Pac-Man. That we didn't have a Horizon Zero Dawn, a Mario Odyssey, anything that really blows us away. We were looking at these blips on the screen, and that was worth $100. I mean, really think about it. The library of games for the Atari isn't exactly celebrated today. Sure, there are definitely some standouts, like I just mentioned. Pitfall was great. Asteroids, Space Invaders, these are all ones that are classics even today. But for the most part, these games were just bad. It was just really easy to feel like you were ripped off back then, spending a ton of money on a game that really just barely functioned. Then couple that with bad game after bad game flooding the market, along with new consoles showing up every day and some of the weirdest looking accessories showing up behind them, it really wasn't that surprising to see the market crash and drop over 97% of its value in 1985.
So the reason I told you about the Atari and kind of where the video game market was at the time, I think it's important to see really how tough it would be for anyone to get into the console market, especially a company from Japan that would try to be entering the US's market that was so, I guess, feeling like they were ripped off or beaten down by Atari, ColecoVision, Intellivision. There was just a lot of systems that really didn't provide a lot of quality for the money that was being put out there. But Nintendo showed up with a very compelling system, and there's a lot of things that they did kind of to revolutionize, I guess you'd say, the gaming market at the time. I think probably one of the biggest ones was definitely the controller. Now, of course, we know the D-pad well today, right? We really do. It's on everything. We complain about it on certain systems having a good D-pad or a bad D-pad. But Nintendo, they brought this to market, made it popular, and they introduced a game alongside of it that we'll get to in a second. But this controller was so weird at the time, but it was so cool also because of this D-pad, because of like the red clicky buttons and the rubber start and select. It's simple now, but at the time, this was futuristic. Now looking around the system very quickly, it does have a front-loading tray, and what's funny is originally it was supposed to be a top loader, but they had to go back through and redesign it. It's actually a pretty funny little clip from Icons, which is a G4 show I used to watch religiously back in the day, all the time. Every time it was on, I watched every episode so many times, but I loved their NES episode. And they talked about the NES, and they really went through the history, and originally this was supposed to be a top loader. And they really went around to a bunch of trade shows. No one liked the thing, so they redesigned it. In fact, according to engineers and even Howard Lincoln himself in interviews, this design that you see today with the black stripe and of course the front tab and everything that's here with the Nintendo logo on the front and a little bit of red to it, that was designed in like an hour. They had to go in, design it, and get it ready in an hour.
And our president, Mr. Arakawa, called myself and my designer and said, you know, this is the shape of what they want to produce the NES in here. Can you make it look good? And you've got an hour to do it.
And they did it. And that's, you might see it as, yeah, that's about an hour's worth of work, but we look back at it now and we just remember this design so well. But it had the front-loading tray, and we're going to talk more about that in depth as we get inside of this thing. And then it did have on the back RF out, a channel changer, so you go between 3 or 4, because at the time we were all through coaxial RF cables. And then, of course, a power. And then they did have, which was actually I was actually thinking pretty far ahead here, the yellow and red, so you had actual video out, which was good, because even at the time, not a lot of us had those kind of TVs. So that was something we actually ended up using going into the 90s, as this kind of sat around, even going up against the Genesis at the time. I also like that they used all Phillips head screws, and I kind of wish that Nintendo had stuck with that.
Nintendo was a company based out of Japan that had been entering the arcade market with great success. Before that, however, they were mostly known as a toy company and, strangely enough, for running a chain of love hotels. However, once some of their arcade releases like Donkey Kong started to take off, Nintendo realized the video game market was a viable place to make money. In Japan, video games were still going strong, with the video game crash of '83 mostly being an issue that solely existed in the United States. So in 1983, Nintendo released the Famicom alongside Donkey Kong and Popeye, and after some initial speed bumps that had to do with recalls around the chipsets, the Famicom went on to be the best-selling console in Japan by the end of 1984. With Nintendo now a part of the gaming market, they set their sights on a part of the world that desperately needed a new system to play.
See, the thing about the Nintendo, it's actually very easy to get apart. So if you do end up getting one of these and you want to play around with it, it's not a difficult system to actually tear down and check out. You seriously just need a Phillips head screwdriver and you can get this whole thing apart in a few minutes. Seriously, I just took this thing apart, 6 screws, and they all fall out like that, but 6 screws and you're in. That's it. The top comes off and you can start working on it or doing what you need to do. This one definitely has some age, as it has quite a bit of dust in here. There is a lot of Phillips head screws though, because you can see they have like the shielding on the top, kind of metal RF shielding and everything. So you have all of that. But we're going to take this off too, because the thing I really want to show everyone is that 72-pin adapter. See, back then, they went with a 72-pin adapter despite using a 60-pin adapter on the Famicom. It was a top loader, and I look back on it now, and I kind of wish they had stuck with that top-loading cartridge. I have a feeling they wanted to differentiate this as much as possible from the Atari and other top-loading systems, right, where you could pop it in the top. They wanted to do everything they could to be different, and a front-loading system that you push down was different enough, I think, that coupled with them putting Rob the Robot with it to try to label it as something other than a game console, because back then, game console label was seen as like the kiss of death, right? It was just, don't name it a game console. Don't even call it that. Call it like an entertainment station or entertainment system. That's what they did, Nintendo Entertainment System. So that's pretty much why I think they went with that design, because originally it was going to be a top loader, and these probably would have worked better going forward. Although, to be fair, the 72-pin adapter is fairly easy to replace. It's not a difficult thing to do. In fact, we're going to check that out now as we take the RF shielding off. The NES, of course, uses a 72-pin adapter and this spring-loaded tray. And the idea is the game goes in here, it connects with the 72-pin, but it doesn't touch it completely. But when you push it down, it then pushes the cartridge down into those pins and makes connection, and you start playing. Unfortunately, that's also where it seems to fail a lot, because the 72-pin adapter will be bent over time, it corrodes, there's a lot of stuff. We would all blow into the game cartridges, and that's actually one of the worst things you can do, because the moisture from your breath would actually cause it to start rusting. So that was kind of a problem. So the 72-pin adapter is the thing that everyone always talks about being an issue, and it is. It's actually attached to the back, similar to how it would attach to a cartridge when you put a cartridge in. It's using those same kind of pins on the other side, and it comes out pretty easily. And you might be wondering what you can do with this. Well, believe it or not, you can actually boil a pot of water, drop this in for about 10 minutes or so, and it'll fix it. The boiling water will actually clean it, similar to what you do with like an ultrasonic cleaner, but it will actually boil it, it'll clean all the pins off, and it'll even contract and compress the plastic a bit. But when you do that, you don't even really have to unbend any of this stuff. Generally, you boil it for about 10 minutes, you pop it back in, and it'll just work. It's actually a really cool way to fix it, and I'm not kidding, I'm being serious. You can go drop this in a boiling pot of water, let it dry, get a junk game, and kind of just pop it on and off a few times, and you'll be good to go. It's really that easy. The third-party ones, unfortunately, have some issues. They always seem to have like a death grip on the game, even without bending it down, and I don't know if they don't have the dimensions right, or they don't have the metals correct, or what, but third-party ones, unfortunately, are kind of annoying to deal with. So it's actually a bit easier if you can find an OEM 72-pin adapter that has been messed with. You buy that online and you boil it, you'll be in good shape as well if yours is like massively destroyed for whatever reason. Now, the rest of the board actually comes out. Everything else is modular. The controller ports, the power button, reset button, it's all modular. The board comes out and it's this size. It's not like a massive thing. And now we can start looking over our chips and see what this thing can do. Now, of course, the NES, when it broke onto the market, it needed games. And fortunately for Nintendo, they actually had a pretty good game designer in the wings with Shigeru Miyamoto. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he came out with Mario, designed that, put it next to the NES, and the NES took off. And a lot of people tend to wonder, what was it about the original Nintendo that really caught people and captivated them? Well, there was an interesting technique that showed up around that time that the preceding consoles didn't really have. The Atari 2600 and television, all of those, they didn't really have hardware scrolling like the Nintendo did. See, Nintendo has a picture processing unit, or PPU, and that was able to scroll the picture. So take Mario, for example. You start up and you move to the right, and all of a sudden the screen moves, right? Which makes you wonder, wow, what's further down the line here? With the Atari 2600, you were pretty much stuck to static screens. There were some games where the screen would be able to be changed and you'd be able to go up and then it would change the next one instantly, but the screen never moved like that. Take Metroid, for example. Great use of it, by the way, because you would go back and forth between two rooms and everything would move, and it was just very smooth. Mario even worked on having momentum and everything. That was a big deal, and I think that's one of the biggest reasons the NES was such a night and day difference. And then, of course, the games were just fun, but having something like that scrolling effect where levels just felt like anything could happen here soon, you weren't seeing the whole picture, I gotta keep playing, that was a big deal. Even like Gradius used it in a slower way to help to get the player to continue moving through and really make, I guess, the whole thing look like a motion. It was pretty cool. So that was something that I really liked and was really neat about it. All right, let's take a look at the board now. You can see right away, they actually labeled some of them. They have a big lettering there, NES CPU 04, but the CPU is actually to the left, and they do label them a bit. U6 CPU. That's the Ricoh 2803. That's actually an 8-bit microprocessor they developed. And then to the right, at U5, you have the PPU, and that's the picture processing unit that they custom made for this system. Now, the processor itself that Rico put in here is clocked at a massive, get ready for this, 1.79 megahertz. I know, right? That's pretty fast. The resolution actually was designed to be 256 by 224, 52 colors available. There are a set limit that they can have on screen, whether it's 1624 or 25. But then they also have 64 sprites on screen with 8 per line. Now, the interesting thing here is it does have video RAM and then just RAM itself. So it has 2 kilobytes of RAM for the system, 2 kilobytes used for video RAM as well. And what was really cool at the time was a lot of people talk about the NES and the Super Nintendo, but they talk about the Super Nintendo with the idea of the Super FX chip as chips that would help the system along, right? Well, the NES actually was already doing that. In fact, there are a lot of chips that the NES would use. There was the MMC, which is a memory mapper chip or controller. They would use that in several different games. I remember Mario, I believe Mario 2 used a custom one that was kind of weird and everything. The board was a little odd, and people used that to make like Final Fantasy 3 and stuff. But the MMC 3 was very interesting. That was used in a lot of games, a lot of RPGs you might have played even. But they used, Konami had their own chip. I think Sunsoft had their own chip. There were a lot of chips in the cartridges you would buy that would help this system along, similar to different chips for the Super Nintendo, with the most popular one that everyone quotes as being the Super FX chip. Well, the NES actually did it first. I've always wondered what the expansion slot is on the bottom. I don't think it was ever used, and I'm curious if they had like a disk unit or something in mind for it, but I don't remember ever using that thing. I don't remember everyone even talking about it, but it's there. It's wired up. I don't really know what it's for exactly. I mean, I guess this is when Nintendo was on like the cutting edge for a lot of their stuff. I mean, seriously, now I know people talk about Nintendo as kind of being like behind the times when it comes to hardware, but at this time, even though the Genesis came out a bit later, I mean, this was kind of on the market by itself for a few years and nothing really contested it or was even close. But at the time, Nintendo was really setting the standard here with hardware. And I think that was pretty cool, whereas now, obviously, we see that they're not, although they are kind of setting the standard for the handheld space. But there was a point in time where Nintendo was setting the standard for hardware and like what you needed to do to have a good-looking game and a strong running game. Nintendo was doing it back then, all the way up to the 64 and even say GameCube, I guess.
In October of 1985, Nintendo went ahead with a small launch of the NES that was specific to the New York City market. There were a few different bundles, however, the most popular set included a system bundled with Super Mario Bros. For $100. The NES did well enough in New York to warrant a nationwide launch the following September. The NES went on to be a massive success, selling over 60 million units worldwide. In the end, the NES actually sold best in the United States, with over half of those 60 million units being sold there, which really illustrates the turnaround this system caused. A country that was not at all interested in games after being burned by the terrible curation of quality control in the early 80s winds up being the strongest market a few years later. Even today, the US is the market that spends the most on console games every year. So really, if anyone out there ever asks you what the Nintendo Entertainment System did for games that was just so important, simply tell them this: it got us all playing games again in a time where no one wanted to play games. And that is amazing.
And that is the original Nintendo system. It was pretty cool. It was a system that really set the standard back in the day, and it's going to be important forever. I don't think it'll ever go away. I think that's something that people always remember fondly, but I think it's also something people have to remember for the future, because of course you learn from history, and the Nintendo Entertainment System really did some different things in the background as well, with Nintendo having restrictions put on third parties, which is something that Atari did not do, and that kind of led to a crash. Curation was important then, it's still important now, and Nintendo, while they were fairly strict, did their best to keep things kind of, I guess, within reason is what you'd say, even though some of the games that released weren't very good for the Nintendo. LJN, they did their best to crash it again, I guess you'd say. But thanks, guys, for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you're very curious about the Nintendo even further than this, like going even really into the details, that Icons video that I really liked, it's on YouTube. So I'll actually leave a link to a YouTube video that has that entire thing, and you can watch it, and it's just a fun watch. They did a good job with it, and I really enjoy that episode, so I'll leave a link down in the description if you want to go a little further with kind of the history of the Nintendo, and you actually hear it from some of the executives and higher-ups at that time, like straight from them, so I would check it out. Thanks guys for watching. Make sure you hit the like button if you liked it, guys, dislike if not, and I'll see you guys in the next video.